Your mother passed away this morning. Cardiac arrest. Dr. Mitchell handed me the death certificate across his desk, the paper crisp and official, bearing the hospital seal in raised blue ink that caught the fluorescent light. I stared at it, without really seeing it, the words blurring together into meaningless shapes, my mind still catching up to the reality that my mother was gone. The office was cold. Too cold. The way hospitals always are, and smelled of antiseptic and coffee. A framed diploma hung on the wall behind Dr. Mitchell's head, credentials from a medical school I'd never heard of. A photograph of him, with what I assumed was his family, sat on the corner of his desk. Pretty wife, 2 children. Everyone smiling like they'd never known loss. She'd been in the ICU for 2 weeks, sedated and intubated, her body fighting an infection that the antibiotics couldn't quite defeat. Pneumonia, they'd called it. Though it had started as something simpler, a chest cold that wouldn't clear, a persistent cough that kept getting worse. At 83, my mother's immune system couldn't mount the defense it once had. I'd known this moment was coming. I'd prepared myself for it, or thought I had. I'd imagined this conversation 100 times during those 2 weeks, sitting in the ICU waiting room with bad coffee and outdated magazines, watching other families receive their own terrible news. But preparation doesn't make grief any less heavy. Anticipation doesn't soften the blow of finality. I'm Beatrice, and my mother Eleanor was 83 years old when she died. She'd lived a full life, raised 3 children alone after my father died of a heart attack when I was 12, built a successful career as a high school principal at one of the toughest schools in the district, retired with dignity and a pension that kept her comfortable in her assisted living apartment. She'd been sharp and independent right up until the pneumonia hit her 2 months ago, the infection that had landed her in the hospital and eventually stolen her from us. Just 2 months ago, she'd been complaining about the food at the assisted living facility and planning a trip to visit my sister in Baltimore. Now she was gone, reduced to a piece of paper with official stamps and medical terminology. Thank you. I managed to say to Dr. Mitchell. My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else, like I was listening to a recording of a stranger expressing gratitude for something that deserved no thanks. For everything you did for her. I know you tried. I'm sorry we couldn't do more, he said. His expression was appropriately sympathetic, his tone practiced and smooth, the voice of someone who'd delivered news like this hundreds of times before. How many times had he sat behind this desk, handing over death certificates, watching families crumble? How many times had he said these same words, with the same careful mix of professional distance and human compassion? Did it ever get easier, or did it just become routine? Your mother was a remarkable woman, strong, resilient. She fought hard. She did. I agreed. Though the words felt hollow. Everyone said that when someone died, that they'd fought hard, that they were strong, that they were resilient, as if dying were a moral failing, a sign of insufficient willpower rather than the inevitable end of every human life. My mother had been strong. She'd also been mortal, and mortality always wins in the end. I looked down at the death certificate in my hands, forcing myself to actually read the words instead of just seeing shapes. Time of death, 6:15 a.m., cause cardiac arrest. Contributing factors, sepsis, pneumonia, advanced age, it all looked correct. Official, final. The kind of document that closes a chapter and allows the bureaucratic machinery of death to grind forward, banks to be notified, accounts to be closed, property to be distributed. But something nagged at me, a detail that didn't quite fit into the narrative I'd been building in my head over the past 2 weeks.
6:15?
I said, looking up at Dr. Mitchell. Are you sure about that time? That seems early. Yes, Dr. Mitchell said. His voice was calm, certain, unbothered by my question. The nurse on duty noted the time when she couldn't detect a pulse. It's all documented in the medical record. Why do you ask? Because I was here at 7, I said slowly, the timeline reconstructing itself in my mind as I spoke. The hospital called me at 6:30. I remember looking at my clock when the phone rang, thinking it was too early for good news. I got dressed, I drove straight here, no stops, no delays. I got here at 7, maybe a few minutes after, and I went to her room. I paused, remembering the walk down the ICU hallway, the sound of machines beeping, the smell of disinfectant. The way her room had looked in the morning light, shadows still clinging to the corners, she was still warm. Her chest was moving. I thought she was still breathing. I sat there holding her hand for, I don't know, 10 minutes, 15? I was talking to her, telling her it was okay to let go, and then the nurse came in and told me she'd passed away. Dr. Mitchell's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it surprise, concern, or something else? That can happen, he said smoothly, his voice still calm and professional. The body sometimes continues certain reflexive movements, even after death. It's not actual respiration, just residual muscle activity. The diaphragm can contract, the chest can appear to rise and fall. I know it's disturbing to witness, but it's quite normal. It doesn't mean the person is still alive. I wanted to believe him. God. I wanted to accept the simple explanation and move on with my grief, to take this certificate and begin the process of burying my mother and sorting through her belongings and all the other painful tasks that death demands of the living. But I'd spent 30 years as a paralegal, working for a law firm that specialized in medical malpractice cases. I'd read thousands of medical records, reviewed hundreds of death certificates, learned to spot the inconsistencies and timeline discrepancies that signaled something wrong. And this timeline didn't make sense. If my mother had died at 6:15 a.m. and I'd arrived at 7 a.m., why had the nurses let me sit with her for 15 minutes before telling me she was gone? Why hadn't anyone stopped me from entering her room, from talking to her, from holding her hand and believing she could still hear me? ICU protocol was clear. Once a patient was deceased, the body was supposed to be prepared, and the family notified immediately. No one was supposed to sit with a corpse, thinking it was their still living mother. Who called me? I asked. Who was the nurse who found her? I'd like to thank them, too. I stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. To what? To ask them why they'd let me sit with my mother's body without telling me she was already gone. I'd have to check the records, Dr. Mitchell said. He was standing now, moving around his desk in a clear signal that our meeting was over. His body language was practiced, efficient, the movements of someone who needed to end uncomfortable conversations and move on to the next task. The nursing staff changes shifts at 7 a.m., so it's possible there was some confusion during the handoff. If you have any other questions about the death certificate or need additional copies for insurance purposes or estate matters, please contact the records department on the 3rd floor. Again, Mrs. Patterson, I'm very sorry for your loss. Your mother was a wonderful woman. I left his office with the certificate in my hand, and doubt blooming in my mind like a dark flower. Something was wrong. I couldn't articulate exactly what, couldn't point to a specific fact or detail that proved anything improper had happened. But 30 years of reading medical records and looking for patterns had given me an instinct for when something had been manipulated, when timelines had been altered, when documents had been crafted to hide rather than reveal the truth. And that instinct was screaming at me now, telling me that my mother's death certificate contained lies wrapped in official language and stamped with authoritative seals. The funeral was held 3 days later at Mount Zion Baptist Church, where my mother had been a member for 50 years. The building sat on a corner lot in the old part of town, its white steeple visible from blocks away, its red brick facade weathered by decades of storms and summers. I'd been baptized in this church when I was 8 years old, standing in the baptismal pool in a white robe while the congregation sang hymns. I'd been married here at 23, walking down the center aisle on my father's arm just months before he died. I'd buried that same father here when I was 24, learning too young what it meant to lose a parent. And now, 40 years later, I was back to bury my mother. The sanctuary was full, every pew occupied, people standing along the walls and crowding into the narthex and spilling out onto the front steps into the October sunshine. Former students she'd mentored filled the left side, many of them now middle-aged themselves, some bringing their own children to pay respects to the principal who'd believed in them when no one else had. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson had a reputation at Lincoln High School as someone who didn't tolerate excuses but would move heaven and earth to help a student who genuinely tried. She'd written hundreds of college recommendation letters, had personally driven students to campus visits, had paid for SAT prep courses out of her own pocket when the school budget couldn't cover it. Colleagues she'd worked with occupied the center pews, Other teachers and administrators who'd taught alongside her for decades, who'd weathered budget cuts and policy changes and the endless bureaucratic challenges of public education. They traded stories in hushed voices before the service began. Remembering staff meetings where Eleanor had spoken truth to power, remembering the time she'd stood up to the superintendent over class size limits, remembering her laugh that could fill a room and her fierce determination to give every kid a fair shot at success. Neighbors and friends who'd loved her clustered toward the back, women from her book club that met monthly at the library, fellow members of her garden club who'd helped her maintain the spectacular rose bushes that had once surrounded her house, bridge partners from the senior center where she'd spent her Thursday afternoons. The threads of a life well lived, woven together in this sanctuary that had witnessed every major moment of her journey, from young mother to respected educator to beloved grandmother. My brother Thomas and my sister Joyce sat with me in the front row, along with our various spouses and children. We'd been a close family once, before life and geography and the inevitable drift of adulthood pulled us apart. Thomas lived 2 hours north, with his second wife Lisa, managing a car dealership and rarely making the drive down for holidays. Joyce had moved to Baltimore after college and stayed there, building a teaching career of her own and starting a family that kept her busy and distant. We saw each other maybe twice a year, Christmas and Thanksgiving, if we were lucky, less often if schedules didn't align. But we'd all loved our mother, and now we came together to say goodbye to the woman who had held us all together when we were young and scattered, who had somehow remained the center of gravity even as we'd orbited further and further away. The casket at the front of the church was polished mahogany with brass handles, lined with white satin that gleamed under the sanctuary lights. My mother lay inside wearing her favorite dress, navy blue with pearl buttons, the one she'd worn to my daughter's wedding 3 years ago. Her hands were folded across her chest, a Bible tucked between her fingers. The funeral director had done good work. She looked peaceful, almost like she was sleeping, though I knew that peaceful appearance was the result of careful makeup and strategic lighting, rather than any actual tranquility in death. I'd chosen the casket myself 2 days ago, had sat in the funeral director's office and paged through a catalog of options as if I were selecting furniture for a living room renovation. "This one is very popular," the director had said, pointing to a mid-range model, solid construction, beautiful finish, very dignified. As if dignity were something you could purchase, as if the quality of a casket somehow reflected the quality of the life it contained. I'd chosen the mahogany because my mother had always liked dark wood, had always preferred traditional styling over modern minimalism. If she had to spend eternity in a box, I reasoned, it should at least be a box she would have approved of. The service began with hymns, Amazing Grace and How Great Thou Art, songs my mother had sung in this church for half a century. The choir's voices rose toward the vaulted ceiling, harmonies blending and separating, familiar words washing over us like water over stones. I'd heard these hymns 100 times before, but today they hit differently, each line about grace and redemption and eternal rest, feeling both comforting and desperately inadequate. The minister spoke about my mother's life, reading from notes I'd provided over the phone the day before. Eleanor Patterson, born 1940, died 2023, survived by 3 children, 7 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren, retired principal of Lincoln High School after 35 years of service, active member of Mount Zion Baptist Church, volunteer literacy tutor, avid gardener, devoted grandmother. The facts of a life reduced to a paragraph, printed in the program that people would take home and stuff in a drawer and eventually throw away without reading again. But then the minister moved beyond the facts and into the stories, and my mother came alive again in the telling. He talked about the scholarship fund she'd established in my father's name, funded entirely by her own salary over decades of small donations. He talked about the student who'd been homeless his senior year, who my mother had let sleep in her office after hours so he wouldn't miss school, who'd gone on to become a social worker helping other at-risk kids. He talked about the time she'd organized a sit-in at the district office when they'd threatened to cut the music program, how she'd led 100 students and their parents in protest songs until the superintendent agreed to find the funding elsewhere. Friends and colleagues came forward to share their own stories. Mrs. Rodriguez, who taught English across the hall from my mother's office for 20 years, told about the time my mother had personally driven a student to the hospital when she'd gone into labor during third period, had stayed with her through the delivery because the girl's parents had kicked her out. Mr. Chen, who'd been a new teacher when my mother was already a veteran administrator, talked about how she'd mentored him through his first difficult year, had observed his classes and given him feedback that was honest but never cruel, had believed in him when he'd been ready to quit and find another career. One of my mother's former students stood up, a woman about my age, well-dressed and confident, who introduced herself as Dr. Andrea Williams. "I wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for Mrs. Patterson," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "I was failing 9th grade English when she called me into her office. I thought I was in trouble. Instead, she asked me what was wrong at home, because she knew, somehow she just knew, that kids who suddenly start failing usually aren't stupid, they're struggling with something else. Turns out my mom had just been diagnosed with cancer, and I was helping take care of my younger siblings while she did chemo. Mrs. Patterson arranged for me to do my homework at school, in her office where it was quiet and I could focus. She made sure I had dinner from the cafeteria before I went home. She checked in on me every single day for 2 years, until my mom was in remission and I was back on track. I graduated high school, went to college on scholarships Mrs. Patterson helped me apply for, went to medical school, became an oncologist. I treat cancer patients now because of what Mrs. Patterson did for me and my family. She saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. She saved my life." The service ended with another hymn and a benediction. Pallbearers lifted the casket and carried her down the aisle and out into the sunshine. We followed in a long procession to the cemetery where my father had been buried 40 years earlier. They lowered the casket into the ground next to my father's grave, reuniting them in death after 4 decades of separation in life. After the burial, we gathered at my house for the reception. My living room filled with people eating casseroles and potato salad, drinking sweet tea, talking in those hushed tones people use around death. Hours passed. The crowd gradually thinned. By 7 p.m., only family remained. That's when Thomas cornered me. He found me in the kitchen, scraping plates into the trash. "Bia," he said, "we need to talk, now. Just you and me and Joyce." Something in his voice made me stop and look up. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his eyes holding a mixture of anger and fear. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Not here," he said. He glanced at my daughter. "My car, 5 minutes. Tell Joyce." We climbed into Thomas's SUV, parked at the curb, and he locked the doors. Thomas pulled a document from his jacket pocket, a will, folded in thirds. "This," he said. "Someone gave this to Lisa at the reception. Just walked up, handed her an envelope, and walked away. Lisa opened it and found this inside." He handed it to me. I turned on the car's interior light and read, "Last Will and Testament of Eleanor Patterson." The document was dated 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, when my mother had been unconscious in the ICU, sedated and intubated, completely unable to communicate. But there was her signature at the bottom, and beside it, a witness signature, Dr. Mitchell. "This leaves everything to you, Thomas," I said slowly. "The entire estate. Nothing for me, nothing for Joyce. Just you." "I know," Thomas said. His voice was tight, angry, and I had nothing to do with it. "I swear to God, B, I didn't know anything about this until Lisa showed it to me 20 minutes ago." I kept reading. The will was professionally formatted, typed on law office letterhead, "Howard Green, attorney at law." The language was formal and precise. It revoked all prior wills. It named Thomas as sole beneficiary and executor. It was witnessed by Dr. Arthur Mitchell, Maryland. She certified that Eleanor Patterson had been of sound mind when she'd signed it. But my mother hadn't been of sound mind 2 weeks ago. She'd been in a coma. "This is a forgery," I said. "I know," Thomas confirmed. "But it's a good one." "Who gave this to you?" Joyce asked from the back seat. "Lisa found it," Thomas said. "Someone left it in an envelope at the reception." "Lisa worked at Mom's assisted living facility," I said quietly. "She was Mom's physical therapist. She had access to Mom's room, to all the consent forms Mom signed. She could have practiced copying Mom's signature." "Are you saying my wife forged this?" Thomas's voice was dangerous now. "I'm saying someone did," I interrupted. "And whoever did it needed access and opportunity. Lisa had both." "Let me take this to a notary tomorrow," I said. "Have it examined. If it's legitimate somehow, I'll apologize. But if it's fake, we need to know. Because if someone forged Mom's will, what else did they do? After the service, after the burial, after the reception at my house where people ate casseroles and told stories about my mother's kindness and strength, Thomas cornered me in the kitchen. "We need to talk about Mom's will," he said. "Can it wait?" I asked. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, not ready to deal with the practical details of death. "We just buried her." "It can't wait," Thomas said. His voice was tense, urgent. "Because there's a problem. A big problem." He pulled a document from his jacket pocket, a will, dated 2 weeks before my mother's death. I'd seen my mother's will before, the one she'd had drawn up 5 years ago when she'd sold her house and moved into assisted living. That will had divided her estate equally among the 3 of us. The money from the house sale, her savings, her life insurance, everything split 3 ways. But this new will was different. "This leaves everything to me," Thomas said. "The entire estate, nothing for you, nothing for Joyce, just me." I took the document and read it carefully. It was my mother's signature at the bottom, or something that looked like her signature. But the date made no sense. "This is dated 2 weeks ago," I said. "Mom was in a coma 2 weeks ago. She was sedated. She couldn't sign anything." "I know," Thomas said. "That's what I thought too. But look at the witness signature." I looked, and my blood ran cold. The witness was Dr. Mitchell, the same doctor who had pronounced my mother dead, the same doctor who had been treating her in the ICU. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "Mom couldn't have signed this. She was unconscious." "I know," Thomas said again. "But someone wants us to believe she did, and that someone went to the trouble of getting a doctor to witness it. Did you talk to the lawyer who supposedly prepared this?" "I tried," Thomas said. "The name on the document is Howard Green, an estate attorney downtown. I called his office. They have no record of my mother as a client. They never prepared this will." "So it's a forgery," I said. "It's a forgery," Thomas confirmed. "But it's a good one. Good enough that if I tried to probate it, it might actually hold up in court unless we can prove it's fake." "Who gave this to you?" I asked. "Where did it come from?" "Joyce," Thomas said. "She found it in Mom's things at the assisted living facility. Someone had left it in her room, in an envelope with my name on it. She gave it to me this morning." I looked at the will again, at the forged signature, at Dr. Mitchell's witness statement. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make this look legitimate. Someone who knew my mother's signature well enough to copy it. Someone who had access to her medical records, her personal effects, her room at the assisted living facility. Someone who wanted Thomas to inherit everything and Joyce and me to get nothing. "We need to take this to a notary," I said. "Get it examined. Prove it's fake." "I already did," Thomas said. "This morning, before the funeral, the notary looked at it and said the signature doesn't match Mom's known handwriting. She compared it to other documents Mom had signed, her lease at the assisted living place, her medical consent forms. The signature on the will is close, but it's not exact. Someone copied her signature, but they got some of the details wrong. So we can challenge it," I said. "We can prove it's fake and go back to the original will." "Maybe," Thomas said. "But there's something else." The notary noticed something weird about Dr. Mitchell's witness signature. She said it looked like it might have been signed before the date on the document, like someone had him sign a blank form, then filled in the details later. "Why would he do that?" I asked. "I don't know," Thomas said. "But I think we need to find out." The next morning, I took the forged will back to the notary myself. I needed to see it with my own eyes, needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with. The notary's office was in a strip mall on the edge of town, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service. Inside, the waiting area smelled of paper and old coffee. A middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck greeted me from behind the desk. "I'm Margaret Chen," she said. "Your brother called ahead. He said you'd be bringing the document for a second examination." I spread the will on her desk. "Can you tell me exactly what's wrong with it?" I asked. "I need to understand what we're looking at." Margaret put on her reading glasses and bent over the document, pulling out a magnifying glass from her desk drawer. For several minutes, she examined the signature in silence, occasionally referring to a folder Thomas must have left with her containing samples of my mother's real signature. "Here," she finally said, pointing with a pen to the signature on the will. "See how the capital E starts? Your mother's real signature has a very specific loop here. She starts high, comes down, makes the loop small and tight. But this signature starts the loop lower and makes it wider. It's close, but it's not exact. Whoever copied this, practiced, but they didn't get every detail right. Could it hold up in court? I asked. Could someone argue it's legitimate? Maybe, Margaret admitted. If there were no other samples to compare it to, if a judge only looked at this one signature in isolation, they might accept it. But I've got 3 other examples of your mother's signature here, and none of them match this one exactly. The differences are small, but they're consistent. This isn't your mother's handwriting. What about the witness signature? I asked. Dr. Mitchell's signature. My brother said you noticed something strange about that. Margaret nodded. She moved her magnifying glass to Dr. Mitchell's signature and the date written beside it.
See the ink here?
She said. The way it sits on the paper, Dr. Mitchell's signature is in blue ink, and it looks like it was made with a ballpoint pen. But the date, October 10th, is in the same blue ink but written with a different pen. You can see the difference in the line weight and the way the ink absorbed into the paper. The signature was written first, and the date was added later with a different pen. So someone had him sign a blank document, I said, and then filled in the details afterward. That's what it looks like to me. Margaret confirmed, which means Dr. Mitchell might not have known what he was signing. Someone could have told him it was a consent form or a medical release, had him sign it, and then used that signature to witness a forged will. Or he knew exactly what he was signing and got paid to do it, I said. Margaret looked at me over her glasses. That's also possible. Either way, this document is not legitimate. If I were you, I'd take this to the police. I thanked her and left with the will in my bag and a growing sense of urgency in my chest. If Lisa had forged this will, if Dr. Mitchell had been involved, what else had they done? Had they simply hoped my mother would die naturally and the forged will would go through probate without anyone noticing, or had they done something more deliberate, more sinister? I thought about the death certificate. Time of death, 6:15 a.m. But I'd arrived at 7 and found my mother still warm, her chest still moving. What if she hadn't died at 6:15? What if someone had changed her time of death on the certificate to match a timeline that made their story work? And if they'd altered the death certificate, what else had they altered? What had actually happened to my mother in that hospital room between 6:15 and 7 a.m.? I went to Dr. Mitchell's office again, unannounced. The receptionist tried to turn me away. Dr. Mitchell is with patients all morning. He can't be disturbed, but I pushed past her and knocked on his office door. I heard him say something irritated, and then he opened the door, saw me, and his face went dark. "Mrs. Patterson," he said. His voice was ice. "I believe I asked you not to come back here. I have questions about my mother's death certificate," I said. "About the time of death specifically, and about this." I pulled out the forged will. "About why you witnessed a signature that you knew was fake." "I don't know what you're talking about," Dr. Mitchell said. But his eyes flickered to the will, and I saw recognition there. He knew exactly what I was talking about. "The notary says this signature is forged," I said. "She says your signature was made before the date on the document. Someone gave you a blank form to sign, and you did it, and then they used it to forge my mother's will. So either you were tricked, or you were complicit. Which is it?" Dr. Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Get out of my office. My mother was in a coma 2 weeks ago." I continued. "She couldn't sign anything. You were her doctor. You knew that. So why did you witness a signature that couldn't possibly be real?" "I'm calling security," Dr. Mitchell said. "What did Lisa promise you?" I asked. "How much did she pay you to sign that form?" His hand froze on the phone. For just a second, and his mask slipped, and I saw something flicker across his face. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "I don't know anyone named Lisa," he said. "Lisa Patterson," I said. "My brother's wife. She worked at my mother's assisted living facility as a physical therapist. She would have known you from patient referrals. She would have had opportunities to talk to you, to convince you to help her." "I've never met your brother's wife," Dr. Mitchell said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then why did you witness this will?" I demanded. "Why did you sign a document that you must have known was suspicious?" Dr. Mitchell was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Leave my office. Don't come back. Don't contact me again. If you continue to harass me, I will press charges." I'm going to the police, I said. I'm going to show them this will and the notary's analysis and your involvement, and they're going to investigate how my mother really died, because I don't think she died at 6:15 a.m. like you claimed. I think something else happened, and you helped cover it up. I left before he could respond. My hands were shaking as I walked to my car, but I felt strangely calm, strangely certain. I knew what I had to do now. I had to go to the police. I had to tell them everything. The forged will, the suspicious time of death, Dr. Mitchell's involvement, Lisa's access to my mother. I had to let them investigate properly, because I couldn't do this alone. But first, I needed to talk to Thomas. I needed to warn him that when I went to the police, they would investigate Lisa. They would look into her background, her finances, her relationship with Dr. Mitchell. Thomas needed to be prepared for what they might find. I called him from the parking lot. "Thomas," I said when he answered, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to the police. I'm going to tell them about the forged will and Dr. Mitchell's involvement. They're going to investigate Lisa. They're going to ask questions about her past, about how she met you, about her access to Mom. You need to be ready for that." "Bia, you're overreacting," Thomas said. But his voice sounded uncertain. "Lisa wouldn't. She's my wife. She wouldn't do something like this." "Then let the police investigate." I said, "Let them prove she's innocent." "But Thomas, I went back to Dr. Mitchell today. I confronted him about the will, and he knew exactly what I was talking about. He knew that signature was witnessed on a blank form. He knows something, and he's scared. Which means there's more to this than just a forged will, which means we need professional investigators looking into how Mom really died." Thomas was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he said, "Okay, go to the police. But Bia, if you're wrong about Lisa, if she had nothing to do with this, you're destroying my marriage. You understand that, right?" "I understand," I said. "And if I'm wrong, I'll spend the rest of my life apologizing. But Thomas, what if I'm right? What if Lisa forged Mom's will and paid Dr. Mitchell to witness it and did something to Mom to make sure she died before anyone could discover the forgery? Don't you want to know the truth?" "Yes," Thomas said finally. "I want to know the truth." I went to the police station that afternoon. Detective Sarah Williams took my statement in a small interview room that smelled of bad coffee and anxiety. I laid out everything: the forged will, the notary's analysis, the suspicious time of death, Dr. Mitchell's witness signature, Lisa's access to my mother at the assisted living facility, her relationship with Thomas that had begun while she was my mother's physical therapist. Detective Williams listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me for a moment. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, "what you're describing is potentially a criminal conspiracy involving forgery, fraud, and possibly something more serious. If what you're saying is true, we'll need to investigate thoroughly. That means interviewing Dr. Mitchell, interviewing your brother's wife, subpoenaing medical records and financial records. It means your family's private business is going to become part of a criminal investigation. Are you prepared for that?" "I want to know how my mother died," I said. "I want to know if someone forged her will, and if that same person did something to make sure she died before the forgery could be discovered. If that's what happened, then yes, I want you to investigate. I want whoever did this to be held accountable." Detective Williams nodded. "Okay," she said. "Give me the will and any other documents you have. I'll start by interviewing Dr. Mitchell and reviewing your mother's medical records. We'll see where the evidence leads." The investigation moved quickly. Dr. Mitchell, when confronted by police, initially denied everything, but when Detective Williams showed him the notary's analysis of his signature, when she threatened him with charges of accessory to fraud, he broke down and confessed. Lisa had approached him 6 months ago, he said. She'd told him she was trying to help a patient with estate planning, that she needed a witness signature on a legal document, that it was all legitimate and above board. She'd offered him $10,000 to sign the form, no questions asked. He'd been struggling with gambling debts, a detail that would later come out in court, and $10,000 had seemed like a lifeline, so he'd signed the blank form, never asking what it would be used for, never imagining it would be attached to a forged will. He swore he hadn't known about the forgery until after my mother died, until I'd shown up in his office with the document. He swore he'd had nothing to do with my mother's death, that she'd died naturally of cardiac arrest brought on by sepsis and pneumonia. He was just a doctor who'd made a terrible mistake, who'd been desperate for money and stupid enough to sign something he shouldn't have. The police weren't sure they believed him, so they dug deeper. They reviewed my mother's medical records, looking for anything suspicious. They interviewed the ICU nurses who'd been on duty the morning my mother died, and they found something that made Detective Williams call me at 2 a.m., 3 days after I'd filed my report. "Mrs. Patterson," she said when I answered, groggy with sleep, "I need you to come to the station. We found something in your mother's medical records, something that changes everything." I went to Dr. Mitchell's office the next day, unannounced. I told the receptionist I needed to speak with him about my mother's death certificate, which was true enough. She made me wait 20 minutes before showing me into his office. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, standing as I entered, "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Is there a problem with the death certificate?" "Yes," I said. I sat down without being invited. "There's a problem, several problems, actually, starting with the time of death." "We discussed that," Dr. Mitchell said carefully. "Residual muscle movement can—" "I'm not talking about muscle movement," I interrupted. "I'm talking about the fact that when I arrived at 7 a.m., the nurses acted like my mother had just died. They didn't stop me from going into her room. They let me sit with her. If she'd been dead for 45 minutes, why didn't anyone tell me?" Dr. Mitchell's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "I can't account for what the nursing staff did or didn't do. If you have a complaint about their conduct, I can direct you to—" "I also have questions about this," I said, pulling out the forged will. "This document that you supposedly witnessed, the one where my mother, who was in a coma, somehow signed a new will leaving everything to my brother." Now Dr. Mitchell's expression did change. He went very still, his face carefully blank. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is your signature, isn't it?" I pointed to the witness line. "You witnessed my mother's signature on this document 2 weeks ago, according to the date, except my mother couldn't sign anything 2 weeks ago. She was unconscious. So either you witnessed a forgery or you forged the document yourself." "I think you should leave," Dr. Mitchell said. "And I think you should consult with an attorney before you make accusations you can't support." "I already consulted with a notary," I said. "She says the signature is fake, and she says your signature looks like it was made before the date on the document. Like someone asked you to sign a blank form, and you did it without knowing what it would be used for." "Get out," Dr. Mitchell said. His voice was cold now, all pretense of sympathy gone. "Get out of my office, and don't come back. If you continue to harass me, I'll have hospital security remove you from the premises." "Why did you do it?" I asked. "What did my brother promise you? Money? A cut of the inheritance? Or was it something else?" "Security," Dr. Mitchell said, reaching for his phone. "I need security in my office immediately." I left before they arrived. But as I walked out of the hospital, past the emergency room entrance where I'd rushed in 2 weeks ago to see my mother, I knew I was right. Dr. Mitchell had been involved in the forgery. The question was how deep his involvement went, and what else he might have done to make sure the forgery succeeded. I called Thomas from my car. "We need to meet," I said. "You and Joyce and me. Tonight, I need to tell you what I just learned." We gathered at my house that evening, the 3 of us sitting around my kitchen table, like we used to when we were kids, and Mom was at work. I told them about my confrontation with Dr. Mitchell, about his reaction, about the way he'd threatened me and kicked me out. "So he's definitely involved," Joyce said. She was the youngest of us, only 59, a high school teacher who'd inherited my mother's way with difficult students. "But why? What does he get out of forging Mom's will?" "Money," I said. "Has to be. Someone paid him to do it." "But who?" Thomas asked. "I'm the one who supposedly benefits from this will. Do you think I paid him?" "Did you?" I asked. "No," Thomas said. His voice was flat, offended. "Of course not. Mom was my mother too. I wouldn't forge her will and steal your inheritance." "How could you even ask that?" "Because someone did," I said. "And someone had access to Mom's room, her personal effects, her medical records, someone who knew enough about her condition to time this perfectly." "It wasn't me," Thomas insisted. "Then who?" Joyce asked. "Who else would want you to inherit everything?" We sat in silence for a moment, each of us thinking through the possibilities, and then it hit me. The answer so obvious, I couldn't believe I hadn't seen it before. Lisa, I said. Lisa, Thomas's second wife. The woman he'd married 3 years ago after his divorce from his first wife of 25 years. Lisa, who was 20 years younger than Thomas, who'd worked as my mother's physical therapist at the assisted living facility before she'd started dating my brother. Lisa, who had access to my mother's room, who knew my mother's routines, her medical history, her signature from all the consent forms she'd signed, who had everything to gain if Thomas inherited my mother's entire estate, and nothing to lose if the forgery was discovered because legally she hadn't done anything wrong. Thomas would be the one facing consequences. No, Thomas said. But his voice lacked conviction. Lisa wouldn't. She wouldn't do something like that. How well do you actually know her? I asked. You've been married 3 years. You dated for what, 6 months before that? Do you know where she worked before the assisted living facility? Do you know anything about her past? She's my wife, Thomas said. I trust her. Mom's will was forged, I said. Dr. Mitchell was involved, and the only person who had access to everything needed to pull this off. Mom's room, her signature, her medical records, a doctor who would cooperate, was Lisa. She worked at the facility. She would have known Dr. Mitchell through patient referrals. She had the means and the opportunity. What about motive? Thomas asked. Why would she do this? Money, Joyce said quietly. Mom's estate is worth almost $2 million. The house sale, her savings, her retirement accounts, everything. If you inherit it all, Thomas, Lisa gets half of it in the divorce. We're not getting divorced, Thomas said. But if you did, Joyce continued, she'd walk away with $1 million she didn't earn from a woman who trusted her to provide physical therapy and instead got betrayed. That's motive, Thomas. That's a pretty powerful motive. Thomas stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. I need to talk to Lisa, he said. I need to hear this from her. Wait, I said. Don't confront her yet. If she's involved, if she knows we're onto her, she might destroy evidence or disappear. We need to be smart about this. What do you suggest? Thomas asked. I suggest we go to the police, I said. Show them the forged will. Tell them about Dr. Mitchell's involvement. Let them investigate properly. If Lisa is guilty, they'll find the evidence. If she's not, we'll know that too. And if I'm wrong about her? Thomas asked. If she's innocent and I've just accused my wife of forging my mother's will, then you'll apologize and hope she forgives you, I said. But if you're right, if she did this, then you need to know, because the woman you're married to is a criminal who defrauded your own mother. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Okay, he said. We go to the police. Tomorrow morning, all of us. But we didn't make it to the police station. That night, at 2 a.m., my phone rang. It was Thomas, his voice panicked and breathless. She's gone, he said. Lisa's gone. I came home, and her clothes are missing, her jewelry, everything. She cleaned out our joint bank account, withdrew $50,000 this afternoon. She's gone, Bea. She knew we were on to her, and she ran. I sat up in bed, my mind racing. Did you tell her what we talked about? No, Thomas said. I swear I didn't. I came home, and she wasn't here. I thought maybe she was out with friends, but then I checked the bedroom, and his voice broke. How did she know? How did she know we'd figured it out? Dr. Mitchell, I said. He must have warned her. After I confronted him in his office, he must have called her and told her we knew. What do I do? Thomas asked. You call the police, I said. Right now. Tell them everything. The forged will. Dr. Mitchell's involvement. Lisa's disappearance with $50,000. This isn't just fraud anymore, Thomas. This is theft. And if Lisa is running, that's as good as a confession. The police investigation moved quickly once Thomas filed his report. They interviewed Dr. Mitchell, who initially denied everything but eventually admitted that Lisa had approached him 6 months ago with a proposal. She would pay him $10,000 if he would witness a document for her, no questions asked. He'd agreed, thinking it was something innocuous, a power of attorney, maybe, or a financial form. He hadn't known it was a forged will until after my mother died and the document surfaced. Or so he claimed. The police weren't sure they believed him, but without evidence that he'd known about the forgery beforehand, they couldn't charge him with anything more than being an accessory after the fact. They tracked Lisa to Miami, where she'd been arrested trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands with $75,000 in cash. The $50,000 from Thomas's account, plus another $25,000 she'd apparently been hiding. Under questioning, she admitted to forging the will. She'd practiced my mother's signature for weeks, using consent forms from the physical therapy sessions. She'd stolen letterhead from Howard Green's law office when she'd worked there as a temp, before taking the job at the assisted living facility. She'd convinced Dr. Mitchell to sign the witness line by telling him it was for a patient's financial planning document. And she'd done one more thing, something that made my blood run cold when the detective told me. She'd changed my mother's medication the night before she died. My mother had been stable, the detective explained. The infection was serious but responding to treatment. The doctors had actually been optimistic that she might recover enough to leave the ICU. But someone had altered her IV drip, adding a medication that lowered her blood pressure and weakened her heart. The cardiac arrest that killed her wasn't natural. It was induced. It was murder. Lisa confessed to that too. Eventually, she'd needed my mother to die before anyone could discover the forged will. She'd needed Thomas to inherit while the fake document was still fresh, before there was time for lawyers or notaries or anyone else to look too closely at the signature. So she'd killed my mother, making it look like a natural death from her existing conditions, and then she'd made sure the will was discovered quickly so Thomas could begin probate proceedings. She'd almost gotten away with it. If I hadn't noticed the discrepancy in the time of death, if Thomas hadn't brought the will to me immediately, if we hadn't thought to question Dr. Mitchell, Lisa would have inherited $1 million, divorced Thomas, and disappeared. My mother would have been just another elderly patient who didn't survive her hospitalization. No one would have investigated. No one would have known. But Detective Williams had found something in my mother's medical records that changed everything. I drove to the police station in the middle of the night, my mind racing with possibilities. What had they found? What evidence had been hiding in those medical records all along? Detective Williams met me in the same interview room where I'd given my statement. She looked exhausted, like she'd been awake for days. A stack of medical records sat on the table between us, pages flagged with bright sticky notes. "Mrs. Patterson," she said as I sat down. "Thank you for coming. I know it's late, but I thought you'd want to know what we found immediately." "What is it?" I asked. "What did you find in Mom's records?" Detective Williams opened one of the folders and pulled out a medication chart, the kind hospitals use to track what drugs are administered to patients, when, and by whom. "Your mother was receiving several medications through her IV line," she said. "Antibiotics for the infection, sedatives to keep her comfortable, medications to support her blood pressure and heart function. All of it was documented here by the ICU nursing staff." She pointed to a series of entries dated 2 weeks before my mother's death. "But look at this," she said. "On October 10th, the same date as the forged will, someone added a new medication to your mother's IV, propofol, a powerful sedative that's also used for anesthesia." "Why would they give her more sedatives?" I asked. "She was already unconscious." "That's what we wondered," Detective Williams said. "So we interviewed the ICU nurses who were on duty that day. None of them remembered ordering propofol for your mother. None of them remembered administering it. And when we checked with her attending physician, Dr. Mitchell, he claimed he never prescribed it." "So where did it come from?" I asked. Though I was starting to understand. "According to the medication log, it was administered by someone with the initials LP," Detective Williams said. "Lisa Patterson, your brother's wife, had visitor privileges at the ICU because she was family. She would have been able to access your mother's room. And as a physical therapist, she had basic medical training. She would have known how to add medication to an IV line." My hands were shaking. "Why would she give Mom more sedatives?" "To keep her unconscious long enough to forge the will," Detective Williams said. "Think about it. If your mother had woken up, even briefly, someone might have been able to ask her about the will. She might have been able to indicate that she hadn't signed anything. But if she was deeply sedated, unresponsive, then Lisa could forge the signature, and no one would be able to contradict her." "But that's not murder," I said. That's keeping someone sedated. That wouldn't have killed her." Detective Williams turned to another section of the medical records. "No," she agreed. "The propofol alone wouldn't have killed her, but there's more. The night before your mother died, someone altered her IV drip again. This time, they added a medication called dobutamine. It's used to treat low blood pressure and heart failure, but only in very specific doses. Too much dobutamine can cause a heart attack. I felt the blood drain from my face. Lisa gave her too much. According to the medication log, yes, Detective Williams said, the dose administered was 3 times what would be considered safe for someone in your mother's condition. Her heart couldn't handle it. She went into cardiac arrest at 6:15 a.m., exactly as Dr. Mitchell documented, except it wasn't a natural death. It was induced. Your mother was murdered. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. My mother had been murdered. Someone had deliberately given her an overdose of medication to cause a heart attack, and that someone was my brother's wife, a woman who had seemed kind and caring, who had smiled at family dinners and brought thoughtful gifts for birthdays, who had said all the right things about loving my brother and respecting his mother. Does Thomas know? I asked. Not yet, Detective Williams said. We'll need to bring him in for questioning, along with his wife. But Mrs. Patterson, I need you to understand something. The evidence we have is circumstantial. The initials in the medication log, the timing of the medications, the forged will, it all points to Lisa, but without a confession or additional physical evidence, a good defense attorney might be able to create reasonable doubt. We need to be very careful about how we proceed. What do you need from me? I asked. I need you to let us do our job, Detective Williams said. Don't confront Lisa. Don't tell Thomas what we've found. Not yet. We're going to arrange to interview them both tomorrow, separately. We'll show them the evidence and see how they react. If Lisa knows we've found the medication records, she might confess, or she might run. Either way, we'll be ready. But Lisa was already running. The next morning, when police went to Thomas's house to bring him and Lisa in for questioning, they found Thomas alone, devastated and confused. Lisa had left in the middle of the night. He said she'd taken her clothes, her jewelry, her passport. She'd cleaned out their joint bank account, $50,000 withdrawn at 3 a.m. from an ATM downtown. She was gone, and she hadn't left a note or explanation. She knew. Detective Williams told me over the phone. Somehow, she knew we were onto her. Maybe Dr. Mitchell warned her after your last visit. Maybe she just panicked. Either way, she's running, which is as good as a confession. They tracked her to Miami through her credit card purchases, a plane ticket bought at the airport, a rental car, a hotel near the beach. By the time police in Miami located her, she'd already tried to board a flight to the Cayman Islands with $75,000 in cash. Airport security detained her when the money triggered alarms during screening, and Miami police arrested her on a fugitive warrant from our state. Under questioning, faced with the medication records and the forged will and the evidence of her flight, Lisa finally confessed. She'd been planning it for months, she said. She'd married Thomas specifically because she'd known his mother was wealthy, because she'd calculated that an elderly woman with health problems wouldn't live much longer naturally, and that a forged will could give her access to that wealth. She'd practiced my mother's signature obsessively, had paid Dr. Mitchell $10,000 to witness a blank form, had waited for the right opportunity to present itself. When my mother got sick and ended up in the ICU, Lisa saw her chance. She forged the will while my mother was unconscious, used Dr. Mitchell's signature to make it official, and then started planning how to ensure my mother died before anyone could discover the forgery. She'd given her the propofol to keep her deeply sedated, making sure she couldn't wake up and contradict the forged signature. And then, when the will was safely created and hidden, she'd administered the fatal dose of dobutamine, inducing the heart attack that killed my mother. It was premeditated murder for financial gain. It was cold, calculated, and absolutely without remorse. The trial took 18 months to get to court. Lisa's defense attorney tried every angle, argued that the medication logs were unreliable, that the initials could have been anyone's, that my mother's death was natural and the timing was just unfortunate coincidence. But the prosecution had too much evidence. The forged will, Dr. Mitchell's testimony about being paid to sign a blank form, the medication records showing dangerous doses administered under Lisa's initials, the $50,000 in cash she'd been carrying when she was arrested at the airport, the fact that she'd run instead of staying to prove her innocence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found her guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, forgery, theft, fraud. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dr. Mitchell, who had cooperated with the prosecution in exchange for a plea deal, received 5 years for being an accessory to fraud. He was also stripped of his medical license and would never practice again. His testimony at Lisa's trial had been damning. He'd admitted that Lisa had told him the will was just a formality and that he'd known deep down that something about the situation didn't feel right. But he'd needed the money and had convinced himself it wasn't really his problem. Thomas was destroyed by the whole thing. He'd lost his mother and discovered that his wife was a murderer who'd been using him all along. He couldn't face the house they'd shared, couldn't sleep without nightmares. He moved in with me for 6 months after Lisa's arrest, gradually piecing his life back together, trying to understand how he'd been so blind. "I should have seen it," he said one night, sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m. because he couldn't sleep. "I should have known something was wrong. The way she always asked about Mom's finances, the way she volunteered to handle Mom's physical therapy appointments, insisted on being the one to take her. I thought she was just being helpful. I thought she cared. She fooled all of us," I said. "She was good at pretending. That's what con artists do. They make you believe there's something they're not." "I was so stupid," Thomas said. "I married her within a year of meeting her. I didn't check her background, didn't ask enough questions about her past. I wanted to believe I'd found someone who loved me. After my first marriage ended, after 25 years with Karen, I wanted to feel young again. I wanted to believe this beautiful younger woman actually cared about me and wasn't just after my money or Mom's money or whatever she could get." "You're not stupid," I said. "You're human, and humans want to be loved." "Lisa exploited that. But Thomas, that's on her, not you. You didn't forge the will. You didn't murder Mom. You were a victim too." It took him a long time to believe that, a long time to stop blaming himself for bringing Lisa into our family, for not seeing through her deception, for not protecting our mother from the threat that had been living in his own house. Joyce handled it differently. She withdrew into her work, spent every evening with her own family, as if by surrounding herself with people she trusted she could somehow make up for the betrayal we'd all experienced. She started a support group at her school for students who'd lost parents, channeling her grief into helping others navigate their own losses. She rarely talked about Lisa, or the trial, or what had happened, preferring to focus on moving forward rather than looking back. And I grieved. Not just for my mother, but for the innocence we'd lost as a family, for the trust that had been shattered, for the years of therapy and legal proceedings and painful conversations that had followed. I grieved for the mother who should have died peacefully in her sleep, after a long life well lived, not murdered in a hospital bed by someone she'd trusted to help her heal. We buried my mother again, in a sense, had a second memorial service once we knew the truth, once her death had been properly investigated and her killer identified. This time, there was no question about how she died or why. This time, we could grieve honestly, without the nagging doubt that something was wrong. My mother's real will, the one she'd actually signed 5 years ago, was probated. The estate was divided equally among the 3 of us, the way she'd always intended. Thomas donated his share to a foundation in my mother's name that provided scholarships for underprivileged students. Joyce used hers to start a program at her school for kids who'd lost parents. I put mine into a trust for my grandchildren, so they could remember the great-grandmother they'd never really known. And I kept the forged will. I framed it and hung it in my office, a reminder of what almost happened, of how close evil came to winning. I look at it sometimes when I'm working, when I'm reading legal documents and contracts and the endless paperwork that makes up my job, and I remember that every signature matters, every witness line means something, every detail is important. Because if I hadn't noticed that my mother's time of death didn't match my arrival at the hospital, Lisa would have gotten away with murder. 5 years after the trial, I visited Lisa in prison. I don't know why I felt compelled to go, maybe for closure, maybe for answers, maybe just to see the woman who had killed my mother and tried to steal our inheritance face to face one more time. She looked older, harder, her eyes cold in a way they'd never been when she was married to Thomas and pretending to be a devoted wife and daughter-in-law. We sat across from each other in the visiting room, a table between us, guards watching from the corners. "Why did you come?" she asked. Her voice was flat, empty of emotion. "I wanted to know if you regret it," I said. "If you understand what you took from us." Lisa laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Regret?" she said. "I regret getting caught. I regret trusting Dr. Mitchell to keep his mouth shut. I regret not getting on that plane to the Caymans a day earlier. But do I regret trying to get what I deserved? No, I don't regret that at all." "Deserved," I repeated. "You weren't even family. You were married to my brother for 3 years. You took care of my mother for 6 months. What made you think you deserved her money?" "I worked for it," Lisa said. "I spent hours with that old woman, helping her walk, helping her exercise, listening to her talk about her perfect children and her perfect life. Do you know how exhausting that was? How much patience it took? And for what? Minimum wage and a thank you? I earned that inheritance more than any of you. You just had the luck of being born to her. So you killed her," I said. "You killed a woman who trusted you because you thought you deserved her money more than her own children." "I did what I had to do," Lisa said. "And if you'd never noticed that stupid time discrepancy on the death certificate, if you just accepted what you were told like normal people do, I'd be living in the Caymans right now with $1 million and a new life. This isn't my fault. This is yours. You couldn't just let it go." I stood up, suddenly desperate to be away from her, from the poison in her words and the emptiness in her eyes. "I hope you live a very long life," I said. "I hope you spend the next 40 years in this place, remembering every day what you lost because you were too greedy and too stupid to get away with murder." I walked out without looking back, and I never went to see her again. My mother has been gone for 7 years now. The house is quieter these days, filled with the particular stillness that settles over spaces once occupied by larger-than-life personalities. I still live in the same house where I raised my daughter, where my mother came for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, where we'd gathered for that reception after her funeral, when Lisa had received the forged will that would unravel her entire scheme. I'm in my early 70s now, and I think about my mother every day. Some mornings I wake up and for just a moment forget she's gone, reach for the phone to call her before reality crashes back in. I think about the life she lived, the children she raised alone after my father died young, the students she taught and mentored at Lincoln High School for 35 years, the lives she touched with her fierce belief that everyone deserved a fair shot at success. I think about her laugh that could fill a room, about the way she never backed down from a fight when she believed she was right, about the scholarships she funded and the students she personally drove to college visits, and the difference she made in her community. I think about how proud she would be of what her grandchildren have accomplished with the inheritance she left us, the one she actually intended to leave, divided equally among her 3 children, not the forged version that would have given everything to Thomas. My daughter graduated from law school last year using money from her grandmother's trust. My son opened his own business, a bookstore in the neighborhood where my mother taught, carrying on her legacy of literacy and education in a different form. Joyce's program at her school has helped hundreds of kids who've lost parents, giving them counseling and support, and a community of people who understand their grief. Thomas created a foundation in my mother's name that provides scholarships to students from the same neighborhood where she taught. He donated his entire share of the inheritance to it, saying he couldn't accept money that Lisa had murdered to obtain, even though legally it had always been his by right. The Eleanor Patterson Educational Foundation has sent 43 students to college so far, all of them kids who might not have made it without the financial support and mentoring services the foundation provides. My mother would have loved that. She would have been so proud. Thomas remarried last year to a woman named Carol, who he'd known in high school. They'd reconnected at their 50th reunion, both of them single again after failed second marriages, though Thomas's had failed for very different reasons than most divorces. Carol knows everything about Lisa, about the murder and the trial, and the betrayal. She's patient with Thomas, on the days when he withdraws into himself, when the memories become too heavy, when he needs reassurance that he's not still that stupid man who got conned by a killer. Joyce's program at her school has expanded to 3 other schools in the district. She trains teachers on how to spot students who are struggling with grief, how to provide support without overwhelming them, how to create safe spaces for kids to process their losses. She rarely talks about our mother's murder directly, but I know that every student she helps, every kid she guides through their darkest moments, is her way of honoring Mom's memory. And I keep working, reading documents and catching details, and looking for truth in the spaces between the words. I semi-retired 2 years ago, cutting back my hours at the law firm, but I still take on cases that interest me. Mostly estate disputes now, cases where families are fighting over inheritances or questioning the validity of wills. I've become something of a specialist in document fraud, having learned firsthand how easy it is to forge a signature, how difficult it can be to prove a document is fake, how much damage can be done when someone decides that greed is more important than honesty. I teach workshops now for notaries and paralegals, showing them what to look for, sharing the story of my mother's forged will without naming names. I talk about the importance of examining every detail, of not accepting documents at face value just because they look official, of trusting your instincts when something doesn't feel right. I show them my mother's real signature next to the forged version, point out the small differences that Margaret Chen caught, explain how those tiny discrepancies unraveled an entire conspiracy. And I keep the death certificate. It's still in my files, in the folder with all the other documents from that terrible time. Time of death, 6:15 a.m. I look at it sometimes and remember the morning I arrived at the hospital at 7 and found my mother's body still warm, her chest still moving with those residual muscle movements. Dr. Mitchell had explained away. That detail saved us. That tiny inconsistency that I couldn't let go of, that made me question and investigate and refuse to accept the simple explanation. 30 years as a paralegal, reading documents and looking for flaws and paying attention to the details everyone else overlooked. All of that training led to this, to catching a killer who thought she was clever enough to commit the perfect crime. She wasn't. She was just greedy. And greed makes people careless, makes them overlook the small details that ultimately betray them. My mother used to tell us that the truth always comes out eventually, that lies and secrets have a way of unraveling if you pull the right thread. She was right about that, like she was right about so many things. The forged will was the thread. The time of death was the thread. And when I pulled them, the whole conspiracy came apart, unraveling link by link until Lisa's entire scheme was exposed to daylight. Lisa is still in prison, serving her life sentence at a women's correctional facility 3 hours north. I heard through Thomas that she started teaching GED classes to other inmates, has apparently found some kind of purpose in helping people get their high school equivalency diplomas. I don't know if she's genuinely changed or if it's just another con, another way of manipulating people to think she's better than she is. I don't particularly care. She took my mother from us, and no amount of prison teaching is going to change that. Dr. Mitchell served his 5 years and was released 2 years ago. He lives in another state now, unable to practice medicine anywhere in the country. His medical license permanently revoked. I heard he works as a medical consultant for a law firm, reviewing cases for potential malpractice, using his knowledge to help lawyers build their cases. There's some irony in that, the doctor who helped commit fraud, now helping lawyers prosecute other doctors for wrongdoing. I suppose everyone finds their own path to redemption, or at least to survival. Thomas's first wife, Karen, reached out to him after Lisa's trial. They'd been divorced for 4 years when he married Lisa, and Karen had heard about the murder through mutual friends. She sent him a letter saying she was sorry, that she'd never liked Lisa, but had assumed it was just jealousy over Thomas moving on. She said she should have trusted her instincts, should have warned him that something about Lisa felt wrong. Thomas wrote back, and they've maintained a cordial friendship ever since. His kids from that first marriage, my niece and nephew, now adults with families of their own, have reconnected with him, bringing their children to family gatherings, slowly rebuilding the relationships that had frayed during his years with Lisa. Family gatherings are different now. We still get together for holidays, Thanksgiving at my house, Christmas at Joyce's, Easter rotating between us. But there's a wariness that wasn't there before, a tendency to ask more questions, to be less trusting of new people entering our circle. Thomas's new wife, Carol, understands this. She doesn't take offense when we're protective of Thomas, when we ask about her background, when we want to know about her family and her past. She knows what we've been through. She knows why we're careful now. We toast my mother at every gathering, raise our glasses, and share memories, funny stories about her stubbornness, touching moments of her generosity, examples of how she changed students' lives through sheer force of will and refusal to accept mediocrity. We talk about the Scholarship Foundation and the students it's helping, about the support group Joyce runs, about the grandchildren thriving on educational funding my mother provided. We remember her as she was strong, determined, loving in her own fierce way, and we try to focus on that instead of on how she died. But I haven't forgotten how she died. Haven't forgotten the medication logs that showed Lisa administering fatal doses. Haven't forgotten the forged will or the lies or the calculated cruelty of marrying someone specifically to gain access to their mother's wealth. I carry that knowledge with me every day. Let it inform how I move through the world, how I evaluate people, how I trust. The details always give them away. You just have to know how to look. That's what my mother taught me, though she never intended the lesson to be learned through solving her own murder. She taught me to pay attention, to question assumptions, to never accept simple explanations when the evidence suggests something more complex. She taught me that the truth matters, even when it's painful, even when it would be easier to look away and accept the comfortable lie. She taught me well, and because of that, because I noticed that discrepancy in the time of death, because I couldn't let it go, because I kept pulling at the thread until the whole tapestry unraveled, her killer didn't get away with murder. Justice was served. The truth came out. And my mother's legacy wasn't stolen by a woman who saw her as nothing more than a means to a fortune. That's the inheritance that mattered more than any amount of money. The lesson that truth and detail and persistence can triumph over deception and greed. The knowledge that paying attention to what others overlook can make the difference between justice and tragedy. I carry it with me every day, and I honor my mother's memory by refusing to let truth be buried, no matter who tries to hide it or how carefully they cover their tracks.